There is an ill wind blowing from the north. I looked at Grandpa as he stood in the yard, looking like one of those dogs that's recently smelled something it doesn't like. It was about a week before Christmas, and the snow had already started coming down a little. It hadn't stuck yet. We were still waiting for the real blizzard that would make its way through Appalachia, but what we had made it more than tolerable to dig out all the Christmas decorations and get everything set up for our usual winter offering. We'd been doing our usual setup, which seemed to take right up until Christmas Day most years. Grandpa's yard looked like an enchanted Christmas wonderland, and I was sure that any year now he would have me set up a little toy shop and make a whole area for him to sit in his Santa Claus outfit. I didn't mind. I liked Christmas at Grandpa's house, but when Grandpa said stuff like that, you had to take notice. Grandpa didn't just throw out lines like that because he thought they were cute. Almost everything he said along those lines was a warning of some kind or another. No, not a warning. An omen. Well, the wind is really whipping, so I suppose it wouldn't be outside the realm of possibility that we might be picking up a deer carcass or something. I said it nonchalantly, trying to clear the air more than anything, but Grandpa looked back at me like I had said something incredibly foolish. Don't you feel it, son? I would have thought you would have noticed it after your time in the woods a few months ago. This one isn't even subtle. It's a foul air that blows in like a storm. I shrugged. The only thing I smell is the moldy bits on some of these old Christmas decorations. Seriously, Grandpa, you need to get a new dancing Santa if you're going to put him out next year. The dancing Santa in question was shaking his butt next to the front porch, singing Christmas carols and laughing like a bowl full of jelly anytime anyone got close to him. His suit really needed a good dry cleaning, and I had to wipe a sheen of green mold off his face when we brought him out this year. Grandpa had probably had him since the mid-90s, and a lot of his decorations were definitely of the vintage variety. Grandpa shook his head, heading up to the porch as he kept smelling whatever foul wind it was that was blowing. He coughed a little as he did so, making me think it might be time for another breathing treatment. Grandpa's cough always got bad during the cold months, and we'd have to be back at the doctor's pretty soon to get more albuterol if he kept going out into the snow like this. It was the only way to keep him out of the hospital. I was worried, but not overly so. Grandpa had had his cough for some time, and I was keeping a pretty good eye on it. "Come have a sit with me for a while," Grandpa said as he patted the chair next to him. "It might be time that I talked to you about some of the things that go bump around this time of year." I was more than happy to take a break from setting up a sleigh and 6 less than tiny reindeer. 2 of our deer still needed to be fixed before the big day. Winter or not, I had worked up quite a sweat, and I was more than happy to have a sit down and listen to some of Grandpa's stories. He dug out a couple of beers from the cooler, and when I gave him a hard look, he pulled out a couple of bottles of water, too. Grandpa knew he was supposed to be staying hydrated, but his habit of beers in the afternoon seemed to be a hard one to kick. "There's a lot of different holiday icons in the world. Some of them you know, but some of them you might be unfamiliar with. There's Santa Claus, Father Christmas, even Odin has played a role in holiday hijinks, but there are others as well, the Yule Lads and Grella, the Yule Cat, Black Peter, Frau Perchta, the Bell Snickles, and, of course, the Krampus. Some of them are holiday gift-givers, but some of them dispense punishments to those deemed naughty." I took a sip of my water, liking the way it pushed the dust out of my throat. I've heard of a couple of those. Krampus is a pretty popular guy these days, and I think I've heard a couple of stories about the Yule Cat. What's that got to do with us, though? This is Georgia, Gramps. We're firmly in the Santa Claus territory, as far as I know. Grandpa rolled his eyes and took a swig of beer, pointedly ignoring his water. Don't let our proximity to the coke factory fool you, kiddo. This is Kashmir, and weird stuff is pretty much part and parcel for the area. Every now and again, something strange comes in around this time of year. I think the last few years it's been hesitant to come in because of all the trouble we've had with the Green Man. The good news is that if something has decided on visiting Kashmir, then maybe it means that old spook isn't going to come around this time of year. The bad news is that now we have to defend the town against something only slightly less terrible. Or, I interjected hopefully, it means that the wind is wrong and you're catching the scent off the dump. I know you're a big one for signs and omens, Gramps, but let's not go jumping at shadows just yet. So far, we haven't seen anything weird. Well, no weirder than usual. Maybe that means we'll get a little bit of a rest this year. It would be nice to have a normal Christmas for a change. I could feel Grandpa's agreement, but he said nothing. Grandpa always seemed to prefer to be on guard. I'd be on your guard, my boy. This year just seems to be an odd one.
That's for sure,
Came a voice from the woods, and we both looked up to see Glimmer walking out of them. She was dressed in what could generously be called leather armor, and there was still quite a bit of skin showing. She'd clearly just come from a hunt, and the cold did not seem to bother her in the least. She had her bow slung over her shoulder, several knives hanging off her belt, and I blinked as I noticed a club nestled across her back that appeared to be made of a jawbone. Whatever hunt she had been on, I prayed I would never be the subject of it. She gave me a kiss as she came onto the porch, taking a seat beside me and asking what we were talking about. We're discussing the strange wind that seems to be blowing in as the holiday gets closer.
I'm glad someone else feels it. I've been tracking something through the woods for 3 days, but it eludes me. It's heading for the town, but I don't know what its intentions are.
Grandpa looked at me as if to say, "You see?" before turning back to Glimmer. "Any idea what it is?" I asked.
We thought it might be a bear, but it appears to be larger than any bear we've ever seen. Then we thought it might be one of the hairy ones, the ones who were here before we were, but they generally do not go that close to civilization. This one has been skulking around the town and watching people, and he's getting a little closer than we dare to get. The Queen has forbidden us from going into the town unless we have strict orders from her. And we can't stalk this thing if we can get closer than 5 miles.
Grandpa took a swig of his beer, but when he saw me looking at him, he sighed and drained his whole bottle of water before crumbling up and leaving it on the table. "There, I drank it. Are you happy now?" He coughed a moment later, ruining whatever illusion he had been going for. "I'll be happier once that cough is gone," I told him seriously. "At any rate, I'm sure I'll go coughing into the ground, but not today. Glimmer, could you ask your queen for special permission to come into town with us the next time you return to your people?" Glimmer reached into the cooler for her own beer, wrinkling her nose at the smell as she opened up the top.
I will, but I will need to know why. Are you hunting this creature as well?
"Not yet," Grandpa said, "but we may be soon. We could use a hunter of your skill to help us when the time comes." Glimmer puffed up with pride at his words.
I would be glad to go on an adventure with the two of you. It seems I'm always left out of the adventures when they come around.
She said. She gave me a very hard look. "I told you both times Grandpa woke me up in the middle of the night, and I had no way to get a hold of you. The last time we went on a sudden and unexpected adventure, You were over 1,000 miles away at your sister's wedding.
True. You missed quite the event as well. We celebrated for nearly 2 weeks. It was one of the biggest gatherings I've seen in quite some time, though I expect our wedding will be even bigger.
Either way, Grandpa said as he tried to pull us back to the subject at hand, ask your queen for permission. I'm gonna go take a nap. A nap? I asked him, not sure I'd heard him right. I don't think I've ever seen you take a nap in the middle of the day. Grandpa got up and began to make his way inside. I'm sure you young people would like some time alone, and an old body like mine has to make sure he has enough strength for what may or may not be ahead. A few days later, I woke up and felt like something was off. I looked at the clock and discovered that it was about 9:30 in the morning. By now, I should be hearing Grandpa knocking around downstairs as he busied himself with his daily back and forth. Grandpa liked to eat with the dawn, so he should have long ago eaten some oatmeal or an egg and some toast, and this was usually when I found him at the kitchen table, wrapping presents or tidying up in the living room or watching television with the volume much too loud and the subtitles off. The house was unusually quiet for a change, and I didn't like it one bit. I went downstairs and called out for him, but there was no response. I checked in the living room, I checked in the laundry room, and I even went to Grandpa's room, knocking before heading in to check on him. The bed was made, but something was missing besides my grandfather. Grandpa's room was too large for somebody living by themselves, but it was very Grandpa. He had a little entryway that was full of bookshelves, and upon those shelves you could find anything from the Keys of Solomon to Grit magazine. There was a little desk with an ancient desktop computer on it, and it was a wonder that it still worked. Grandpa usually used it to check his email or his Facebook account, but I don't think I had seen him do it for longer than 10 to 15 minutes in all the years I'd been here. Beyond that was a bedroom with a large bed, a pair of nightstands, and a wardrobe that always reminded me of the one that took those kids to Narnia in the story. There was a bathroom off the bedroom, but the door was closed, and no light came from behind it. Grandpa wasn't in there either, and I was starting to get worried as I moved out onto the porch that jutted off the front of the house. I'd expected to find him in the yard or on the porch drinking a cup of coffee as he listened to the snow come down. I didn't know what he would be getting up to out in the yard, but I was sure it would require me to bring him inside so I could warm him up and bundle him up before he caught a cold. He was nowhere to be found out there either, and I was just about to go looking behind the house when my phone rang. I looked down and discovered that I was being called by Pamela Winters. I'd given Dr. Winters my phone number after the business at the prison. I figured she probably needed a way to get in touch with us other than Grandpa's intuition, and it was always nice to have allies within the town. I didn't have a picture for her. I hadn't been quite that bold. But as I answered, I heard Grandpa's cantankerous voice in the background as he told someone to leave him alone. "Marcus, it's Pamela Winters. So sorry to bother you, but I have a little bit of a problem." "Oh no, is Grandpa bothering you again? I'd thought we were well past all of this." Grandpa hadn't bothered the good doctor at her office since the two of them had struck up a tentative alliance. I could remember a time when Mom and I had to come pick him up from the police station once a week, and Sheriff Masterson had told us that he'd been yelling at Dr. Winters and accusing her of all sorts of things. It turned out that most of those things were true, but Grandpa seemed to have softened towards her now that they were working together pretty regularly. I really hoped this wasn't some sort of illness, maybe Alzheimer's or dementia, because a magic man as powerful as Grandpa could do a lot of damage if he suddenly couldn't remember his friends from his enemies. Oh no, he isn't bothering us. He's bothering my little brother. He claims to have found a number of footprints around his establishment, and when my brother came out and asked him what he thought he was doing, your grandfather said that he best be on his guard because there was a... She seemed to be trying to find the words, but I could hear Grandpa yelling about something from behind her. Some sort of beastie that he thinks is lurking around the town. He told my brother he must be wicked indeed if this creature is so interested in him, and my brother did not take that particularly well. Could you come and pick him up, Marcus? I don't think he drove here, but if he keeps stirring up trouble, then Sheriff Guthrie is going to come and arrest him, and it's too close to Christmas for a man of his age to be sitting in the drunk tank. I told her I would, and threw on my long coat and grabbed my car keys. Grandpa's old truck didn't want to start, but after a little coaxing, I finally got it into gear and headed for town. I couldn't imagine Grandpa walking the nearly 8 miles through the snow to get to town, but I supposed it was the only way he could have gotten there. I'd asked Grandpa about teleportation once, and he laughed at me and told me that it was nonsense. I asked him about shape-shifting as well, and he said that it wasn't something he'd ever done, and he didn't think he would like to try it either. He said if the good Lord had wanted him to have claws or a tail, then he would have given him some from birth. With the truck still sitting in the driveway, that meant Grandpa had set off pretty early to get 8 miles up the road and cause enough trouble before lunchtime to get me called in to help. Luckily, the snow wasn't very deep, but I could just imagine the hell it was going to play with Grandpa's cough. I sighed. I hadn't wanted to think about that today. Grandpa's cough had been getting progressively worse as time went on. It started out pretty badly, a wet cough that seemed to speak of pneumonia, but as time went on, it became a dry, rattling cough that sometimes brought phlegm up. The doctor couldn't seem to agree on what was wrong, but Grandpa had stopped letting me go back with him during doctor's appointments. "You worry too much, and it makes other people worry as well," he had said when I asked why I had to stay in the lobby. He wouldn't tell me what they had said, but he said they kept giving him a prescription for steroids, and he was a little more willing to take his breathing treatments these days. I didn't want to think about a time when the breathing treatments and the steroids wouldn't help, but I supposed it would come eventually. I turned onto Main Street and smiled as the Christmas lights came into view. The town always did a big showing when it came to Christmas. There wasn't a storefront or a lamppost that didn't have a string of lights or some kind of decoration on it. There didn't seem to be any Scrooges in Kashmir, and as I turned into Old Town, I put my foot down a little harder on the brake than I should have and slid to a herky-jerky stop. Grandpa was standing on the sidewalk and pointing a bony finger at Mr. Seraph. The old demon was smiling at him, clearly not impressed by the old gaffer, and Winter was standing between them, trying to get Grandpa to calm down. There was a young fellow leaning against the wall of a store that I thought might have sold books or been used to publish books, and as I pulled into a parking spot, I got out just in time to hear Grandpa's latest complaint. "Who knows whether he's got anything to do with this or not? When I find cloven hoof prints around the back of a store, I know what I'm gonna find. Maybe whatever I'm hunting is related to the two of you somehow. It wouldn't be the first demon that's been skulking around." Mr. Seraph shook his head. "Old-timer, I have no problem with you, but if you continue to air my dirty laundry on the sidewalk, then I'm going to find one. Sister, isn't there anything you can do about this loquacious friend of yours? It seems like if he keeps talking, then everyone is going to understand our predicament." Grandpa started to retort, but was suddenly racked with a bout of coughing. He clutched his walking stick and coughed violently into the back of his hand, doubling up before I could get an arm around him and hold him upright. Winter looked at him with concern, but Mr. Seraph only turned and walked back into his business with the tall man in tow. "Easy there, Gramps. Let's get you home so we can get some warmth back into you." Grandpa was bundled up, but his hands were still ice cold as I warmed them between my own. "I'm fine," he assured me, but as he fell into another bout of coughing, I kind of doubted it. "No arguments. You're overdue for your breathing treatment anyway. Thanks for calling me, Doc." "No problem. Can't have the town's favorite grandpa freezing to death in a snowdrift or getting set on fire by my temperamental brother." We were back on our way to the house in short order, Grandpa shivering as the heater crisped the both of us. "What were you thinking? You could have died out there." "Oh, hell, I've walked 3 times that far in worse weather than this. The snow's only 2 feet deep, and the weatherman said the low today is 21. What does that have to do with you walking your way into town? I'd have driven you if you'd asked." Grandpa was quiet for a minute, and I'd begun to think he wasn't going to answer when he finally spoke. "I got another one of those weird feelings again. I don't care what they say, there's something going on in town. I can feel it. And if people don't start taking me seriously, then something bad is gonna happen." I sighed. "I want to believe you, Gramps, but the evidence is pretty shaky. I followed your hunches before, but this doesn't seem like one of those times. Why not stay home and just enjoy your Christmas?" "I can't sit idly by while the town is in danger." "Well," I said as we pulled into the driveway, "next time wake me up. I'll go with you, just in case it's more than you can handle on your own." Grandpa perked up. "Do you mean it?" "Sure, but let's just make sure it's during daylight hours. I think 3 times of getting woken up in the middle of the night to go on an adventure is too many for 1 year." We pulled into the front yard, and Grandpa headed in. As I set up his breathing machine, he got in a much-needed breathing treatment, as he seemed less wheezy at the end of it. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but if I could keep Grandpa from walking 8 miles through the snow again, then a little lost sleep would be worth it. I woke up with a start as I heard my grandfather moving around downstairs. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. I shook my head and got up, putting on my slippers as I moved to the head of the stairs. I was ragged, the kind of ragged you only get when you haven't slept more than 4 hours a night in close to a week. This had to stop, or I was going to collapse, and Grandpa was going to get lost in the snow somewhere while I lay in a coma. It had started the day after his walking trip to the town. He'd been up every single night as he attempted to escape the house so he could go hunting this mysterious creature that was wandering around the town. During the day, he would subside on cat naps while he read from the books he kept in his study, and then at night he would rise around midnight so he could sneak out to do investigative work. I'd been keeping tabs on him, sleeping very lightly so as not to lose track of him, but this was the strangest time I had ever had while living with my grandfather. Gramps had always been pretty genial, a guy full of stories who would do his share of the chores and pick up a 6-pack for us to enjoy in the evenings. He taught me magic, taught me about the creatures that lived in the Appalachian countryside. But now I was starting to worry that he might be losing his mind. Grandpa could get funny ideas about things, but he usually had a pretty firm idea on what constituted reality. Just because his reality had fairies and monsters roaming through it didn't make it any less true. Grandpa was formidable. He was the strongest man I'd ever known. His current state of mind was more worrisome than the cough that seemed to plague him. It was no good telling myself that he would snap out of this, because I was beginning to believe that he wouldn't. I snuck downstairs like a kid on Christmas morning, but I didn't find Santa waiting by the front door. Grandpa was dressed in his usual adventure clothes, his long black coat, his blue jeans, his black hiking boots, his thick gloves, his furry hat that would have made a Russian fighter pilot proud, and his walking stick, which he was trying to use to unbolt the door. It was a dirty trick, but Grandpa was topping out these days at about 5'2", and I was still a respectable 6 foot tall. I had him by almost a foot, and I'd put the bolt just high enough that my arms almost couldn't comfortably reach it. I hadn't wanted to, but he'd been sneaking out for a week straight, and I needed those 4 hours of ragged sleep that I got before he managed to escape, so that I could still be active during the day. I had driven out to find him the last couple of nights, and thankfully I'd caught him before he got too far. It was a couple of days before Christmas, and the temperature outside was in the teens, as it slipped closer to the single digits with every day I marked off on my advent calendar. Grandpa was going to freeze out there one night, and that wasn't the sort of gift I was looking forward to getting. I cleared my throat, and he spun around like a little kid caught doing something wrong. He had the decency to look sheepish, but in the face of my crossed arms and stern demeanor, it melted into frustration pretty quickly. I could just blow it off the hinges, you know. It wouldn't take much, just a whoosh of energy, and I'd be out the door. Except then, you know, I'd have to replace it, and I'd still come and get you. Gramps, it's 12 degrees out there right now. Why do this every night? Why do we play these games? Grandpa shuffled his feet. He looked childish, which made my heart hurt. I didn't want to see my grandpa like this man whom I respected so much. He looked as if I had caught him doing something wrong, and now he felt ashamed of it. Even so, I knew that deep down, if he was trying to sneak out, then he knew that something dire was about to happen. You're tired, boy. I can see it. And I know you don't have the energy left to keep up with me. I don't want to inconvenience you. We've been out every night this week, but I know that something's going on in town. I've always taken it upon myself to keep this town safe, and I take that job very seriously. I took a seat on the boot box we had next to the door and put my head in my hands. I could understand his desire to help, but he had to understand that walking 8 miles through the snow was not an option. He was old, he was sick, and he needed to come to terms with the facts. I didn't want Grandpa to feel unfulfilled, but the snow had been getting progressively worse the closer we got to Christmas, and I also didn't want to find him dead in a ditch somewhere. If you're going out, then I'm going out, Gramps. The thought of you getting hurt out there keeps me awake at night, and I'd rather be tired than see something happen to you. Grandpa smiled, but that's when I heard the scuffing of boots on the porch. Grandpa and I turned to look at the door, but it was too foggy to offer much more than a vague impression. Grandpa had his staff, but he snorted when I pulled the .38 out of my bathrobe pocket. He didn't have to say it. I could read it on his face. Even when not festooned in charms and toting a staff, I was always prepared. The presence moved across the porch, its heavy feet coming down hard as it tried to shake the snow off. It didn't sound like a huge, slobbering monster, though. Quite the contrary. The footsteps were cautious, someone who was used to traveling silently when they could. I knew who it was, but when she knocked, I became even surer. I stowed the gun and opened the door, letting the snow and my very chilly fiancée come inside. No matter the season, it always seemed like Glimmer was underdressed. Her pale skin was all but translucent as the snow clung to it, but she had covered most of herself in skins that may have started off life on a wolf or a deer. She was festooned with leather pouches, finely crafted rings that jangled beneath the furs, and a pair of boots with a scruff on them that looked suspiciously ursine. She had her usual array of weapons, and she left her quiver on the porch as the powdery snow spilled out of it. "Glimmer," I said, shivering as she threw her arms around me. Even through my fluffy bathrobe, she was incredibly chilly.
I see both of you feel it too. I'm glad you're up, although you might want to get rest, Hunter. It's very chilly out there, and you're going to want something a little warmer.
"What's going on?" Grandpa asked, inviting her to sit as I went to make some warm tea.
I was stalking something this evening. Something that's been wandering around the town for several weeks. It's gone into the town again. And it's not alone. It has several helpers tonight, and I think it means to do something. I came here straight away, thinking you might want to come with me. Someone needs to act, and I can't think of anyone better than you two.
As the Keurig filled the cup with steamy water, I handed it to her and excused myself. I went upstairs to get my gear together, putting on my wards and digging my boots out of the closet. They were still a little damp from the night after Thanksgiving, but the thick socks I wore took care of that. I put on some thicker pants than the jeans I usually wore, realizing I would be out in the snow for quite a while. These evening trips kept getting longer and longer, and I was tempted to throw on my thermal underwear. I was worried about Grandpa catching frostbite, but I wasn't in a hurry to get it myself either. I also wondered exactly what we were walking into here. 15 minutes later, I was coming down the stairs and asking where we were going. "Glimmer says that the creature is heading into one of the residential areas around Old Town. We should start there and see what it's planning."
I also found this.
Glimmer held out a small metal object. I took it from her and held it up to the light, perplexed by what I was looking at. "It looks like a bell," I said without much conviction. "Like a sleigh bell," Grandpa added with a knowing wink. We were on the road a few minutes later, all of us crammed into Grandpa's old truck, as we headed off for whatever lay ahead. The town of Kashmir can be a hectic place, but it can be quite beautiful too. As we rolled through the town in the wee hours of the morning, the snow coming down around us had me spellbound. Every storefront was awash with lights. All the plastic figures that stood motionless outside were slowly being buried in snow, as their lights within were slowly muffled by all that powder. And everywhere I looked, I could see a warm glow of holiday cheer. Glimmer looked enchanted, as she so often did, and Grandpa smiled as he appeared nostalgic. Maybe he was thinking of Christmases gone by. Maybe he was wondering if he'd be around for next Christmas. It was hard to say, but as a very different set of lights joined the twinkling ones, I sighed and pulled over in front of the general store. Oh boy, what the hell was this about? The cruiser had pulled up behind us, and as someone got out and walked towards the truck, I already knew who it was going to be. We had met the sheriff briefly. He had sat in the back, where Glimmer now sat actually, and after following him through the woods on our way out, I came to realize how particular his gait was. He walked like a man who was hiding an injury, but I think most of it was probably just stress. Sheriff Guthrie always seemed like a man who had a lot on his plate, and Not much appetite for any of it. License and he started, and then brightened as he recognized us. You two? Oh, where are my manners, you three? What brings you all out this late at night? Not heading in to take advantage of all the holiday shopping this time of year, I trust. One look around would have told him that wasn't the case. It was well after 3 a.m., and the only thing that seemed to be open was the car door on his cruiser. I suppose he realized that we weren't doing much more than cruising this late at night, and people out cruising at this time of night are probably up to no good. He was the sheriff, but he couldn't really think that Grandpa and I were out here breaking into people's houses. Could he? No, sir. Someone has informed us of an oddity taking place. You know, something a little off the beaten path. Guthrie had been out in the woods with us. He'd seen the things that we had done and what we had seen while we were out there. He knew there was a little more to all of this than hocus pocus and nonsense, and I wasn't sure how much of it he believed and how much of it he had told himself was just superstition after the fact. And that brought you out here in the middle of the night. Shoot, I wish I had friends like that. Would you mind telling me exactly what you're up to? I think it might be worth getting my boots wet over. We're wasting time, Grandpa said from the front seat. If you're coming with us, then get in, but we do really need to be on our way. Something is afoot, and if you want to be part of it, then you better get in the truck. If not, then you need to let us be on our way before someone gets hurt. Sheriff Guthrie raised an eyebrow. Old man, you realize I could impound your truck and take all of you to jail on suspicion. You're out here in the middle of the night. You're all seemingly armed, and, well, you're all well known for getting up to hijinks. I'd be well within my rights to detain you, but I also have a suspicion that if you're going somewhere, then it might be important. In that case, why don't I follow you? You can show me where you're going, and I can decide if it's important enough for me to just let you wander about unattended. Sound good? I turned to Gramps and started to tell him to be nice, but Grandpa threw his hands up and made an exasperated sound. Why not? If we're going to involve local law enforcement, then it might as well be the sheriff. Come along or don't, but we need to get going. I can feel something out there, and it sounds like it's huge. Guthrie looked like he wanted to get angry, but I cut him off. Look, we aren't doing anything wrong, and we're wasting time. Either come with us or don't, Sheriff, but we have to get moving. Guthrie opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then went back to the cruiser and killed the lights. He followed us into Old Town. We were rolling past the Radiant Meadows apartment complex when Grandpa told us to stop. This is the spot. I can feel it there, just lurking. I looked at the complex. Radiant Meadows was one of 2 apartment complexes in town. It had 7 buildings that held 10 apartments each. There were about 70 homes here, and it sounded like this thing could be anywhere. Any idea where? Grandpa started trying to discern which way the feeling was coming from. But that's when Glimmer popped out of the truck and began looking around in the snow. She looked a little like a hunting dog, her nose down and her butt in the air, and as I got out of the truck, it was hard not to laugh. Any chance you've got the scent? I asked as Sheriff Guthrie came to join us.
I'm not checking for scent. I'm checking for tracks. The snow is coming down, heavier than I would like, but the tracks are still pretty clear. You can see them if you come over here.
I moved over to where she was standing in the snow, and that's when I saw it. It was a hoof print, the whole cloven hoof and everything, and whoever had owned it had been no dainty flower. It was pressed into the snow and even in the grass below it. There were other prints too, regular-sized footprints that seemed to move off in all directions. The weird part was that they seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was as if 6 people had just dropped out of a door and came into our world out of nowhere. Any idea where they are? Glimmer shook her head.
None, but whatever it is, it's definitely big. We should be cautious. There's no telling what something like this could do.
What in the hell is that? We both looked up to find Sheriff Guthrie had not only gotten out of his car, but was also standing over the top of us as the snow collected on his uniform jacket. This is apparently what we're after, I said, as I pointed towards the hoof print. With any luck, we can follow those to wherever the problem is, and if we're further lucky, then we can do it before... There was a loud, piercing scream that erupted from the building with a Christmas light wrapped around the 2 that sat in front of it. It sounded as if it had come from the second story, and sure enough, that was the direction that the hoof prints were heading. "Let's go," Grandpa said, and the 4 of us started making our way towards the apartment. Sheriff Guthrie had his service-issue Glock out. Glimmer had drawn a knife in one hand and a war club in the other, and despite Grandpa's glowering, I had taken out my .38, as opposed to the staff that he seemed to favor. We had come around the back of the apartment when I noticed the wood on the outer balcony was broken, some of it lying in the snow, with most of it lying on the patio. It was as if something very large had forced its way through it, and I looked at Guthrie to find out whether he was still on board or not. He nodded as we headed upstairs.
Whatever is here, it's all, and it's angry.
We came up to find the apartment door had been knocked in, and the front chain was hanging cattywampus from the bolt. The inside was dark, lit only by the infrequent lights from the Christmas tree. Whatever had gone in the front door had left footprints in the carpet, and it appeared that someone, or several someones, had gone barefoot after walking through an ash pile. Their feet were small, something between children and young adults, and as we started to go in, Guthrie put a hand out to stop us. "What do you think you're doing? This is an active crime scene. I need to call this in," and he'd reached for his radio, but Grandpa covered his hand with his and shook his head. "Every minute we wait is another minute that thing has time with whoever's in here. Maybe you can stand for that beyond your conscience, Sheriff, but I can't." Grandpa headed in, Glimmer and I right behind him, and eventually the sputtering sheriff came with us. Someone had broken several of the lights throughout the house, and I was glad for my boots as my feet crunched down. All of us were on high alert, our heads going this way and that as we looked for the threat. But despite our guard, one of them almost caught us unaware. They were hard to see in the dark, and when a pair of eyes and teeth suddenly appeared about 10 feet away from me, backlit by the Christmas tree as it blinked on and off, I turned just in time to bring my gun around before it buried me under its bulk. It wasn't big. My insight about the footprints had been pretty spot on, but when someone hits you with about 130 pounds of force, it takes you by surprise. It hit me around the waist, and I lost my balance as my ass and head bounced against the carpet. I sucked in a breath as I saw Guthrie turn with his service pistol, accepting that I was about to get a through-and-through shot. But Glimmer was faster. She kicked the creature off me and then hit it about the neck with the blunt end of the war club. Now that I could see it a little better, I was surprised that I had seen it at all. It looked like nothing so much as a human being that had been completely dipped in chimney ash. Every inch of him was covered in a dark coating, and he seemed to be covered by a pair of furry breeches and a hair shirt. He had human hands, except for the extra-large fingers, and at the end of each finger was a long, curved nail. All in all, it was the most off-putting creature I had ever seen, and I had seen quite a few of them. It lingered in the uncanny valley, something almost human, and I did not like it being so close. "I was afraid of this," Grandpa said, as he looked at the struggling creature under Glimmer's club. "So you know what it is?" I asked dubiously. "Well, of course. It's a bell snickle. They're another part of the Germanic Christmas folklore. They cause all sorts of trouble, and usually they only come to visit naughty children. Sometimes, however, they also help out something a lot worse than they are." I was going to ask him what was worse than these things, but as if in answer, there was a muffled cry from the back of the house and the sound of heavy hooves as they thundered on the carpet. Guthrie and I were off, running for the back bedrooms. The cries sounded decidedly childlike, and as we rounded a corner, I saw something that would populate my nightmares for a good many years to come. It was huge, a hairy goat man, and he was stuffed into a ragged red coat that seemed as comical as it was horrific. He had long curly horns and a face that looked like it had been stretched a little too far. He was massive, 8 feet tall, and he was squashed into the little room like a jack-in-the-box. The room was decorated half with superheroes and sports posters, and half with princesses and equestrian posters. There were a pair of little beds on either side of the room, and while both were empty, it was pretty clear that they had been occupied a moment before. The boy was missing, but we got there just in time to see the creature shove a screaming girl into a wicker basket on its back. It turned as we stood there, snorting as it rolled out its humongous tongue and threatened to whip us with it. In one hand, it held a bunch of sticks. In the other, it held a long chain with a cruel hook on the end. You wouldn't have thought something like that would be fast, but it turned suddenly and went out the window, shattering the glass and part of the wall as it left the house. Guthrie and I stood there, not sure what to do next. But when the radio started making noise, it brought both of us around. Sheriff, where are you?" Guthrie grabbed the radio off his belt and promptly dropped it, his fingers shaking too badly to do much more than fumble at it. He picked it up, taking it in unsteady hands as he asked whoever was on the other end, a deputy named Brandon, it sounded like, what was going on. "We need to call in the state police or something. We've had about a dozen confirmed kidnappings tonight. Well, I don't know if they're kidnappings, but there's about a dozen kids that are being reported missing in the last couple of hours." What are the details? Well, can you tell me, Brandon?" "Not much. The parents reported a lot of scraping and a lot of noises beforehand, and there's been some property damage to go along with it. There are definitely signs of breaking and entering, but nobody seems to have seen a thing. We need some assistance, Sheriff. We need to call in." Whatever he was about to say was drowned out as a woman began screaming and asking where her children had gone. I was suddenly very glad that Guthrie had decided to come along with us. This would have been a lot harder to explain if it were just Grandpa and Glimmer and I, and we had just come into a person's apartment unannounced. "Rest assured," Guthrie told me, "whenever I get this settled, I'm gonna want some answers." "Sheriff," I told him genuinely, "you and me both." The sun was beginning to come up when Sheriff Guthrie finally finished assuring the parents that everything was going to be okay. It was a bold claim, honestly. I'm not sure that anything was ever going to be okay for them again. Glimmer, her eyes already getting heavy, told me that she needed to find somewhere to sleep. I offered her my own bed, but she declined and asked if we had somewhere dark where she could sleep for the day. I finally told her that we could make her a pallet in the root cellar, and she said that would be fine. Grandpa was looking a little tired as well, and that was good. I really wanted to get some sleep without worrying about him sneaking off. It looks like we might be at this again tonight, and I was beginning to get drowsy myself. We were sitting in the truck when Sheriff Guthrie came back, and he looked madder than I had ever seen him. Okay, I've managed to convince them that this is part of an ongoing investigation, and that we, and by that I mean the police, are tracking a fugitive who has kidnapped their children. How did they take it? Grandpa asked with a fair amount of gallows humor. About as well as anyone would. They're scared to death, and they want answers. Answers that I can't give them. I need to know what's going on. It sounds like the three of you know pretty well what it is. I started to tell Guthrie that I didn't have a clue what was going on. Grandpa patted my arm and gave me a look that let me know he was going to handle this. Sheriff, why don't you come back to our house for breakfast? I'll scramble some eggs and make some bacon and maybe even cook up a couple of flapjacks, and you can sit around and have coffee while I tell you all about it. At least the part of it that I understand. Sheriff Guthrie didn't look happy with that explanation or the invitation, but he nodded and said that he would follow us. We arrived home about an hour later, the snow making it hard to drive at anything approaching a safe speed. I settled Glimmer in the root cellar, assuring her that we would wake her up when we were ready to go again, and returned to the house to the smell of bacon and eggs and pancakes. Grandpa had added a few of those fat little sausages that he liked as well, and I was pretty sure the potatoes sitting next to the cutting board were waiting to be chopped into hash browns. As I set to chopping, Grandpa handed the sheriff a cup of coffee and started explaining. Sheriff Guthrie, how much do you know about different holiday traditions? Sheriff Guthrie took a sip of his coffee and made an appreciative noise before blowing the steam off of it and taking another one. Not much. My family was usually the type for Christmas trees and Santa Claus. I have a cousin who has some kind of tradition with a nun that puts garbage inside of you or something, but I just figured that was a Pentecostal thing. Grandpa chuckled. Well, other countries have different holiday creatures. What we're dealing with is from Germanic folklore. It's called the Krampus. Sheriff Guthrie gave him a stern look over the rim of his coffee cup. You mean that creature from the crappy movie about a decade ago? Similar, but not really. It isn't allowed to just go around taking children willy-nilly. Like most things, there are rules that have to be followed. One of those rules is that he's only allowed to take naughty children, and he's only allowed to put the really naughty ones in his wicker basket. That wicker basket is supposed to be something akin to a portal to hell, and I can't imagine that any of the children he's taken are having a really great time, wherever it is they've gone. Sheriff Guthrie put his coffee cup down and put his head in his hands. I didn't have to ask what he was thinking. It was pretty clear. Sheriff Guthrie was going to have to write a report about how some Christmas horror story had come to town and started taking a bunch of kids. The townspeople of Kashmir might buy some of this, but anyone who wasn't from here was going to have a field day with such a report. It would probably not help when it came to election time either. Guthrie was still just the standing sheriff, not an elected official. If the town didn't think he could keep them safe, especially if he couldn't keep them safe from weird stuff, then there would be a new sheriff come June. So you're telling me that some holiday critter came into town and took a bunch of kids. Great. Just great. Does this town ever stop? It just seems to be the repository for all the weird shit that I have to deal with. Neither Grandpa or I could say anything. We just let him vent. I could commiserate with him. Cashmere could be a little much sometimes. It did seem like most of the terrible things happened in this town, and it was usually stuff that was hard to explain to normal people. How exactly did you go about explaining to people that an 8-foot-tall goat demon was wandering around stealing their children because they'd been naughty, and to top it all off, he was allowed to do so? So, Sheriff Guthrie said, after he'd had a moment to think about it, what do we do about this? Well, the easy answer would be to do nothing. This thing can only operate until December 25th, just like Santa Claus. If we do nothing, it only has one more night to raise Cain, and then it's out of gas. I'm guessing that's not really a valid answer, though, given that you would like to be elected next year. Correct, Guthrie said morosely. Well, then, we're going to need to trap it. Can we do that? Guthrie asked, and I thought, of course. Krampus is no more than a creature of fairy. He's a lot like Santa Claus. His powers are seasonal, and thus he gets them from the fairy queens. We can entrap him the same way we would trap any creature that comes out of Fae. We'll use iron, salt, and other tools of the trade. Barring that, we'll hit him with so much magic that he has to go away, and we'll see if we can get the kids out of the basket while we're at it. Sheriff Guthrie stared at my grandfather from between his fingers, looking like he would really like to take back the last 10 seconds or so he didn't have any of that rattling around inside his head. What do you need me to do? He asked, and he really seemed to be hoping that the answer was something easy that wasn't going to get his head bitten off. I suppose that our first step should be information gathering. Sheriff, why don't you go to the station and see what you can learn from the families? Marcus and I will go have a look elsewhere and see what we can drag up. Right, Sheriff Guthrie said, understanding the implications pretty well. Grandpa and I were going to go make inquiries with people that probably he would be better off not knowing. He was going to go make inquiries with people who would not appreciate us poking our noses where they didn't belong. We would both come together, hopefully with the information that we needed, and make a plan of attack. Right now, however, Grandpa said, as he began putting food on the table, it's time for breakfast. We ate, we filled our bellies, we revitalized our spirit, and we forestalled sleep a little while longer as Sheriff Guthrie headed to the station, and Grandpa and I climbed back into his old truck and headed off to do our own digging. Where to? I asked, stifling a yawn before it could take root. Well, where do you think we should go? Grandpa asked, looking as bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as he ever seemed to. Well, I only know of one group of fairies in town. Suppose we should start there. Seems like they might have a little bit of information about what's going on. Grandpa smiled as if to let me know that I had landed on just exactly what he was thinking. Guess that means it's time to head to the botanical gardens, doesn't it? It would be a little early for a visit to the gardens, but I suppose if we were going to investigate fairies, then we ought to go talk to some. We drove to the outskirts of Kashmir and pulled into the parking lot of the botanical gardens about 20 minutes later. The parking lot was mostly empty, a couple of lonely cars sitting out there as the snow collected around them. But despite the hour, the front gate was manned by a pair of militant-looking creatures that lived within the garden. I had heard Sam call them Brandylow, and he might have been one himself. They usually appeared human, but if you squinted at them and knew what you were looking for, you could definitely see their goatier features. You could pick out the horns, the hair, the legs that ended in hooves, and some of them looked very similar to the creatures that we had caught the night before. I don't want to think about what had happened to that fella, but I suppose it had needed to be done. He'd been dead by the time I got back, his neck very visibly broken, and Glimmer was holding him up and taking him out into the woods. She seemed to be going to dispose of the body, and I tried not to think about what that might entail. The security guys looked up from their conversation and scowled at us, but one of them came out of the office and grinned as he recognized us. "Well, well, mighty early for a pair of wizards to come and pay us a visit. I'm afraid the park is closed, but I suppose if you're looking for someone specific, then I might be able to help you." Grandpa smiled at him, his cheeks still red from spending time out in the cold. "We need to speak with the lady. There's something going on in town, and I really hope she knows more about it than we do." "The lady doesn't just accept social calls. First, we're going to need to..." One of them had begun in his typical security guy speech, but the one that had come out to greet us put a hand on his shoulder and gave him a look. "You weren't here when it happened, or else you'd probably show these guys a little more respect. These two were instrumental in defending the park during the War of Winter, and they were here for the Green Man's Trap last year, too. They're good guys, and they're friends of the lady. I'll take you guys back. She's probably in the greenhouse." We crunched along through the botanical gardens, the snow laying thick on the exhibits. Normally, this would have made everything look wet and a little drab, but something about the magic of this place made every exhibit stand out, as the trees and the flowers set so elegantly with the white powder all around them. They were still running their Christmas spectacular, and I could see rows of decorated Christmas trees that I was pretty sure had just grown that way. There was a gingerbread house, a small array of edible gingerbread men sculptures, a sleigh ride that seemed to take people through the tree forest as they looked at the lights and decorations, and as we walked past the concession stand, I could smell something cooking and felt my already full stomach twinge with desire. The food inside smelled heavenly, no matter what they were working on, and I wondered if it was that sort of fey food that I had always been warned about. The security guard led us to the greenhouse, and as we came in, someone called us by name and clanked up to shake our hand. Sam was looking resplendent in his forest green armor, and I was beginning to wonder if he ever took it off. I don't believe I had seen him out of it in quite some time, and as we traded grips, I was pleased to find that he didn't absolutely break my hand. It was good to know that all those push-ups had been paying off. What are a pair of wizards doing in my garden at this time of the morning? This time of year, magi usually come in threes. Grandpa smiled and shook his head. "We're seeking some information from the lady. Is she in?" Sam nodded, and as if her name had summoned her, the lady came striding from the back room in a snow-white gown that made her look eerily ethereal. She looked like the queen of the sugar-plum fairies, but there was something about her that looked almost skeletal. She looked as if she had aged 20 years, and I began to wonder if the changing of the seasons affected her power. When you belong to the summer court, something that Sam said they did, I wondered what sort of negative effects a little snow and blow might have on you. "Always a pleasure to see my friends," the lady said with an inclination of her head. "What brings you here on such a cold morning?" "We seem to be having some trouble with something from your neck of the woods," Grandpa said. "It's one of winter fairies, the Krampus." The lady nodded. "I know him. He was quite close with the Green Man, and I wonder if they still are. Queen Mab may have ordered them to not have contact with him, but I wonder how many of them actually listened. Has he been sighted in the town?" "He's been kidnapping children, is what he's been doing," I cut in. Christmas is tomorrow, and we need to find him before he makes off with those kids. Any idea how we could do that?" The lady seemed to ponder this, scratching her chin as she looked about fitfully. "Well, the Krampus is a creature of the dark hours, much like your St. Nicholas. That would mean that he would be in his den until nightfall." Grandpa and I shared a look before telling her to go on. "He would have to find somewhere dark and out of the way, somewhere he could reasonably expect not to be found. If you find that place before sundown, then I believe you'll find him." Grandpa and I looked at each other, realizing what needed to be done. It seemed my fiancé was going to be a little sore at me.
One of these days, one of you needs to learn how to track.
It was early afternoon, just after lunchtime, and the four of us were tromping through the woods. Sheriff Guthrie was keeping up the rear, his riot gun in hand as the strap dug into his neck. Grandpa and I were in the middle, and Glimmer, on hands and knees, was checking the snowy ground for signs. It was hard going. The forest was giving up nothing, the half-frozen snow leaving little behind, as the powder came down to cover the tracks that had been left behind. "How hard can it be to follow a huge monster in the woods?" Sheriff Guthrie asked. "There should be enough tracks to follow this thing to Gatlinburg." Glimmer turned his head and fixed Guthrie with a withering look.
If you would like to come and find the tracks instead, be my guest. If not, then be silent and let me look.
Glimmer had not wanted to wake up, but with some coaxing, the two of us had managed to get her on her feet and back on the trail. We'd called Sheriff Guthrie on the way to the apartments where we'd seen the creature the night before. The police had put tape around the apartments, and the officer outside the door looked at us with mistrust. Guthrie pulled up not long after that, nodding to the officer as he put the gun across his back and came to join us. "So what's the plan?" "Well, one of our informants tells us that the creature is hiding in the woods somewhere. If we find it before nightfall, then we can trap it so it can't go do anything." Guthrie shook his head. "Why do monsters always hide in the woods? Any idea where he is?"
They have not a clue. That's why they have asked me to help them.
Glimmer was checking for tracks, looking for signs, and seemed to be a little confused as to where to start. Confused isn't exactly the right word. Glimmer was just not quite certain where one trail began and the other left off. This was no bear, no deer to be hunted for sport. This was a dangerous creature, and it had to be back-trailed very carefully. Glimmer finally pointed into the woods, and we set off as quickly as we could. In the winter woods, it's a very different place than it is in spring or summer in Appalachia. A thick coating of snow lay across everything, and the woods were so quiet you could almost believe you were being stalked at any given time. We went noisily through the snow, our own footsteps echoing through the quiet reprieve, and as Glimmer led us to our destination, Guthrie began asking questions. He had seemed to be holding himself back until he felt we were solidly on some kind of trail. But now that it seemed we might actually find what we were looking for, he was bursting with a need to know. "What are we going to do once we find this thing?" "Well," Grandpa put in, "my grandson and I are going to try to seal it in so it can't get out. It only has another day or so to go, and after that it's out of gas. While we do that, you and Glimmer are going to hold off its helpers." "What sort of helpers? More of those dog things?" Grandpa shook his head. "No, these are likely to be a little more human-shaped. They're called bell-snickles, and they aid the Krampus when he goes out looking for naughty children." The sheriff nodded, but his eyes clearly told us that what we had said didn't make a lick of sense. "Why is he here? I don't think our kids have been any badder than usual." I've wondered that myself, Grandpa said. Do you remember what our contacts told us about the Winter Court? I nodded. Yeah, seems weird they can't keep their own people on a leash. That's just it. They do. Most of the holiday iconography falls squarely in the pocket of the Winter Court. Holiday entities like that have rules, things they can and can't do. But Krampus just showing up to harass our children is not in his usual playbook. He's allowed to come and take naughty children. He's allowed to drag them all the way to hell, in fact, but he's not supposed to be able to mess with just anybody. Santa Claus isn't allowed to just pass out presents as he feels. There would be a lot of questions if some random kid got an expensive game console, no matter how good he had been that year. He's allowed to pass out gifts, but he's not allowed to create a lot of stir. Like I said, there's rules, and they're not supposed to be able to break those rules. That tells me that either the Krampus has some bad information about our kids, or they've been worse than we thought. Guthrie started to ask more questions, but Glimmer held up a hand for silence. She moved some snow aside, really looking at the ground before calling us forward and pointing. There in the frozen mud was a perfect hoof print, and Glimmer pointed towards more, a thick collection of spruces standing in the way.
The clearest one I've seen all day. He's up ahead.
We pushed through the dense clump of spruces and found what we were looking for. It wasn't really a cave, not in the general sense. It was more like a hole that had been dug out like a mouth. The inside was dark, and I could see the hoof prints approaching it through the slightly melted snow around the entrance. There's no way he came in through there. You don't think so? Grandpa asked. Looking at the entrance, the creature I saw yesterday would have barely fit between the spruces that we had pushed through. I didn't see any way that something that big would have fit into a cave. Grandpa put a hand on the wall, and I saw that I might have been wrong. There were long drag marks along the wall of the tunnel, and it looked as if something had snagged some of its fur in the crevice as it pushed its way into the opening. The more I looked, the more I could see ragged fibers also hanging from the entrance, and they looked exactly like the old coat that I had seen the creature wearing. Think about it. He can fit down a chimney and maybe even press himself under a door. Do you think a little thing like a cave is going to stop him? I started to say something, but I shut up as a stick broke audibly to the left of us. Something was moving through the woods, and as I turned my head, I caught movement as they passed through the trees. There were a few of them, 4 or 5, and I realized we were being stalked a moment before they cut out of sight again. Glimmer, you and the sheriff stay here and watch our backs. Marcus and I are going to see what we can see down in the caves. What if you can't contain it? Guthrie asked, as he worked the slide on his riot gun and took the safety off. Then the 2 of you should be scared when the sun sets. This thing is going to come out of the cave, and it's going to be extremely pissed off, and I wouldn't want to be here when it does. Glimmer nodded, drawing out her club, as the 2 of us went down into the earth. I heard grunts and snarls as Guthrie shot, and Glimmer's club connected with something. I wanted to turn around and help them. That was my fiancé, after all, but Grandpa shook his head and told me to come on. They can handle themselves. I've seen Glimmer get out of worse scrapes than that, and Guthrie should be able to take 5 unarmed things with a rifle. How do you know there's only 5? Everything I've read says that the Krampus only gets 6 helpers every year. We killed one of them last night, so he's down to 5. Stop wasting time, boy. We need to get this done. He was right. It was already pushing 2 o'clock, and the sun was going to start setting in about 3 hours. The floor of the cave was steep, but the two of us managed to navigate it fairly easily. Grandpa lit the end of his staff, a little trick I still had yet to learn, and as we descended into the bowels of the earth, I imagined I could hear something breathing. It was deep and jagged, the breathing of something that does not sleep soundly. I hoped it went on sleeping while we did whatever we needed to do. Otherwise, we might have a fight on our hands. We were attacking this thing at the height of its power, and going toe-to-toe with it didn't sound like a good idea. When we came to the bottom of the ramp, I realized just how right I had been. The Krampus was nearly 8 feet tall, and he was about half as wide. He was leaning up against the wall, his chest rising and falling as he slept. He'd set his basket aside, the huge wicker construct that looked like it would give you splinters if you tried to touch it. Grandpa poked at it with a stick and reported that it was a lot lighter than it looked. I hoped so, because it looked like a couple of steel drums wrapped in ragged limbs from here, and I imagined it was probably pretty full. "Take that to the mouth of the cave, and I'll get started in here," Grandpa said. I picked it up, and sure enough, I got a couple of splinters just by touching it. It wasn't as heavy as I'd believed, but I thought maybe I could hear very low and very distant weeping coming from inside it. Surely there weren't 12 kids stuffed into this thing. It was big, but it looked like you might could fit a handful of toddlers at best in there. The creature was magical, however, so I supposed anything was possible. I took it back to the start of the ramp, and when I turned back, I could see that Grandpa had already begun. He had encircled the Krampus in salt. It wasn't the dainty, fine-grained salt that we used at dinner either. It was thick clumps, the kind you usually saw in kosher salt, and he had broken open about 3 containers as he coated the floor around the creature. He added nails to the salt piles, for good measure, the thick iron roofing nails that we used to reattach some of the shingles last spring. Once he had created a perimeter, he gave me the thumbs up and told me to be careful not to smudge any of the salt or nails. "The circle has to be unbroken, or it'll give him a way out." Grandpa reached into the bag that he had been hauling, and as he drew out the heavy iron chains, I wondered how he had brought all of that this far. The chains looked like they'd been used for logging, and as I hefted one of them, it had to weigh 30 pounds. We bound the Krampus' arms and legs together with them, and then I saw Grandpa pull out a thick steel pin and hammer the end of the chain into the wall. The creature didn't move while we did this, and I was shocked at how easy it was. I knew fairies didn't like iron, but you would think that he'd wake up when we started wrapping it around him. You could see the steam rising off of his arms and legs, but he slept as if it didn't bother him. We'd secured him pretty stoutly, and when Grandpa stepped away to put the hammer and nails back into his bag, he nodded as if that would do it. "That's as good as we can do. We could use magic on him, but it might dissipate after sunset." "That's gotta be hurting him. Why is he just sitting there?" "During the daytime, the Krampus sleeps somewhere between here and Fairy. He's not fully here, but he's not fully there either. It means that while he's asleep, no one can hurt him, which is good because he usually hibernates from spring until winter. Most of the Christmas icons do. They store their energy like squirrels keeping nuts. That way, they can be more effective during the season." "You learned all of this in books that you're keeping in your bedroom?" Grandpa smiled and tapped the side of his head. "Throwing around lightning bolts is cool and all, but knowledge, boy, is power." Grandpa said we better get moving, but just as we were starting to leave, I heard the chains clink, and something let out a deep and not altogether healthy roar. I looked back and guessed that we had been at this a little too long, or sunset had started happening a little bit earlier than expected. The Krampus's red eyes were glaring at us, and it was howling in pain as the chains bit into its arms. It was groaning and thrashing at his bonds, and I looked at Grandpa questioningly, wondering if they would hold. As the first one came ripping out of the wall, I didn't think it was going to be all that long before it was back up to its old tricks again. It seemed we might be in for a fight after all. It had one arm dangling a chain already, and as the hissing of steel bit into its flesh, it yanked at its other arm to try and get it free. The hand it had already pulled loose was working at the chain, and I realized that we couldn't have gotten them deep enough to keep it held prisoner. What do we do? Grandpa thought about it, finally coming up with an answer as he pushed the basket into my arms. Get out of here, kid. Take these kids and get out of here. I've got an idea, but it's probably too stupid to work. What are you? But Grandpa shoved at me and told me to go. I ran up the incline, trying to keep the basket from tipping, and that's when I heard the cave began to groan. Whatever Grandpa was doing, the cave didn't seem to approve of it. It was shaking and rumbling, and the whole thing was shedding mass as the ceiling threatened to come down on top of me. I yelled for Grandpa to hurry up, and I was answered by nothing but a series of wet coughs. I got to the top and dropped the basket, running back down as quick as I could as I tried to get the old man out. He was kneeling at the bottom of the cave, rocks already piling up on the Krampus as it tried to struggle free before the whole cave came down on top of it. I scooped Grandpa up under his arms, and the old man was way too light for my liking. He started to protest, telling me that he would be fine, but I didn't believe a word of it. I dragged him out of the cave, and the whole thing threatened to come down on top of us as we went, the rocks finally falling to seal us in. I threw up a shield and tried to push them out of the way. I cared very deeply for the people of Kashmir, but I was not about to get entombed with this creature in order to save them. Grandpa was still coughing, still telling me that he would be fine, but as daylight came up ahead, I saw the entrance beginning to come down. Without thinking, I extended my hand and pushed out the biggest gout of flame I had ever summoned. It flew out like a blowtorch, melting the rocks and hopefully not melting any of my friends that had been standing close to it. The rocks oozed and burnt, the heat making my boots a little runny. I kept running, kept pushing. When we finally came into the daylight, I heard the cave give a tremendous groan and collapse in on itself. The ground shook, and we had to go a little further to get out of the sinkhole that we had created. Guthrie had the basket, being smart enough to pick it up when I had thrown it out into the daylight. And the four of us left the clearing as the ground heaved and everything collapsed in on itself. We had run about a quarter of a mile before we all stopped, everyone but Glimmer panting as we doubled over on the ground. Grandpa was still coughing, but there was definitely laughter mixed in with that grating, wet sound. I'd say, he said, before being racked by another cough, that cave-in should be enough to hold him. I think we might have done it, everybody. I think the children might be safe. Speaking of the kids, Guthrie said as he put the basket down, how do we get them out of this? Grandpa shook his head. How do you get anything out of a basket, kid? Just turn it upside down. Guthrie looked confused before taking the basket and flipping it over. Like some kind of magic trick, pajama-clad children started falling out of it. I'd expected over a dozen, but we had closer to 20 before all was said and done. I suppose maybe some of them had been touted up as runaways, but as the last of them came to a stop in the snow, it was closer to 30 than a dozen. They all looked confused and filthy, clinging to Guthrie as if he would save them. I supposed he had saved them. We all had, and Guthrie tried to organize them as he led them back to town. How do I explain to my supervisor where I got all these kids from?
Tell them the truth, Grandpa said with a wink. Tell them you trailed your suspect into the woods, found they were keeping the kids, but there was a cave-in somehow, and your suspect is now trapped underground. I don't think anybody is gonna look too hard into it when you come back with a bunch of missing kids. Some people are gonna consider that a win. Don't you consider that a win, Sheriff Guthrie?
Guthrie only shrugged. I suppose I do. Good morning, Kashmir. This is the voice of Kashmir, John Marvolo, and it is my great honor to wish all of you a very merry Christmas Day. I'm also proud to report that all of the missing children have been taken back to their families and are hopefully having a very merry Christmas with them this morning. Sheriff Guthrie was given an accommodation by the state police for his successful retrieval of the town's children. He was unable to identify the perpetrators of the kidnapping and could not honestly say how they were able to get in and out without alerting the parents of the children. What he could tell us was that he had brought 28 scared, cold, and dirty children out of the woods, and now they can be reunited with their families. The town owes Sheriff Guthrie a debt of gratitude, and I suppose this may go a long way for his re-election campaign in the coming year. We're gonna get back to the Christmas music now. Stay safe, Kashmir, and we'll see you in a little bit. As the music resumed, Grandpa, Glimmer, and myself sat amongst the remains of our Christmas gifts and drank cocoa and enjoyed the warmth of the fire. Sheriff Guthrie's Christmas present to all three of us had been to keep us out of the town's children abduction case, even though he said that we ought to receive commendations as well for the work that we had done. No one is going to believe that a rogue Christmas entity came in and kidnapped a bunch of kids, but they should know the part that you played in their return. He had told us yesterday when we came to see if he was okay. Most of us were none the worse for wear. Glimmer had a cut on her cheek and another one on her hip, where a bell snickle had fought back. Guthrie had sustained a glancing blow to the side of his right arm, but the two of them had managed to put down the Krampus's 5 helpers without much fuss. Grandpa and I had some bruises and a couple of cuts from falling rocks, but we were in good spirits and good health. Grandpa's cough was still not better, but it was as sporadic as ever, so I took that as a good thing.
Sheriff, that is half the reason my grandson and I do what we do. We aren't in it for the glory or the accommodations. It's a service we do for the town and its people, and we're proud to do it.
Speak for yourself, I had joked. I think we ought to at least get a consulting fee out of this. The sheriff had laughed, but Grandpa had shook his head at me as he bemoaned the values of youth. All in all, it had been an all right Christmas. We'd exchanged gifts when we came dragging up at 10:30 in the morning, and dinner was preparing itself in the kitchen as our ham baked in the oven and our sides set in the fridge waiting to be rewarmed. Glimmer had decided to stay until Christmas, enjoying some time with me and Grandpa as we toasted our victory over the Krampus.
Another year of service to the town, Grandpa said as he lifted his mug. Maybe one of these days I'll write a book about it and let everybody know what really goes on around here.
I foresee a book like that going straight to the fiction section, I said, as I raised my own mug and we started to laugh. Another year spent with Grandpa had come and gone, and I couldn't honestly think of a better place to be as I sat beside my fiancé and a man who was both my teacher and my best friend. I hoped for many more years with Grandpa and many more years of peace here in the Appalachian countryside.